the vast fanatical tapestry of the Imperial Guard, there are regiments of great renown heroes whose names are celebrated across the galaxy. The death corps of Krieg are not among them. They are not heroes. They are penitents. They are the faceless, nameless sons and daughters of a world so thoroughly damned that its only purpose is to offer up its entire population as a blood tithe to atone for a sin that can never be washed away. To understand a Krieg soldier is to understand that they are not fighting for victory, but for a worthy death. For them, the battlefield is not a place of horror, but a cathedral, and their death in the Emperor's service is not a tragedy, but the final glorious prayer of a soul seeking absolution. This story asks a simple, terrible question. How do you corrupt a soldier who does not fear death, but craves it as his ultimate salvation? His throne is not built on a foundation of lies. It is built upon a mountain of truth, a literal mountain of skulls, the collected trophies of every worthy champion who has ever fought and died in his name or against it. The throne itself is of brass, intricately carved, with scenes of every battle ever fought. It sits in the heart of a fortress of the same material, a citadel of pure, brutalist military function. The rivers that surround it are not of water, but of the hot, fresh blood of a billion souls, their steaming vapor rising to stain the sky, a permanent, angry crimson. Khorne himself sits upon this throne, a being of pure divine rage, a god of war so immense that his every twitch sends shockwaves of fury across the galaxy. He does not scheme, he does not whisper. He watches the eternal battle that is his realm, and he roars his approval, his only judgment, a simple, brutal one, blood for the blood, God skulls for the skull throne. He does not tempt the weak, the fearful, or the slothful. Such souls are beneath his notice. His gaze is drawn to the strong, the disciplined, the honorable. His most fertile ground is the soul of the perfect soldier. The path to his service is not a sudden fall, but a slow, logical, and seductive descent, a path of 8 steps. It begins with frustration, the righteous anger of a good soldier trapped in a pointless war, his skills wasted by incompetent commanders. This frustration curdles into anger, a hot, burning feeling that the universe itself is unjust. Anger left to fester becomes hatred, a cold, hard certainty that the enemy, and perhaps the fools in command, must not just be defeated, but destroyed. Hatred finds its only release in violence, the clean, simple, and honest act of the kill. And in this act, the soldier discovers a new, terrible truth, a profound and primal joy in the act of slaughter itself, a feeling more potent than any victory medal. This joy leads him to seek greater, more glorious acts of violence, to begin offering his kills, his battles, as a sacrifice to the unnamed warlike god he now feels a connection to. And the god, pleased with these offerings, answers with a blessing, a boon of unnatural strength and resilience, a gift of fury that makes the soldier even more perfect in his art. This is the final terrible step, for in accepting this gift, the soldier finds his final state damnation, a willing, joyous, and eternal servitude to the blood god, his soul, now forever a part of the great unending war. If Khorne seeks the perfect soldier to corrupt, then Captain Valerius Rex of the Mordian 84th Iron Guard Regiment was the perfect candidate. He was the living embodiment of the Mordian ideal, a man forged in the crucible of his planet's harsh, disciplined culture. Even here in the mud-choked, blood-soaked trenches of the secessionist world Viridian IV, his uniform was immaculate, his greatcoat free of stains, his boots polished to a mirror sheen. His posture, whether standing on the fire step of a trench or leading a charge, was always ramrod straight, a pillar of unwavering order in a universe of chaos. His belief in discipline was absolute, not just as a tool of war, but as a moral creed. To Rex, a sloppy uniform was the first sign of a sloppy mind, and a sloppy mind was the first step towards heresy. He was a masterful tactician, a devoted student of the Tactica Imperialis. He saw war not as a brutal, chaotic brawl, but as a grim and complex science, a problem to be solved with superior strategy, flawless execution, and the unwavering fire discipline of his men. He was known for his brilliant textbook assaults, his ability to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents. But more than that, he was known for his honor. He believed in a right way to wage war. He despised senseless brutality, viewing it as the tool of the savage and the undisciplined. He would never shell a position if there was a risk to civilians, and he treated his prisoners with a cold, correct professionalism that was a rarity in the brutal wars of the 41st millennium. He was in every sense a good soldier, a man who fought not for the joy of killing, but for the righteous, honorable victory of the Imperium. His current battlefield, however, was a place that had little room for such high-minded ideals. The war for Viridian Fork was a grinding, soul-crushing war of attrition. The Viridian secessionists were not monstrous Xenos or gibbering heretics. They were men fighting with the same laser guns and the same desperate courage as his own troopers. The war had devolved into a brutal stalemate, a network of trenches and ruined cities that stretched across the continent, a meat grinder that consumed men and material with a horrifying, insatiable appetite. It was a war that tested the limits of even the famed Mordian discipline. We find Captain Rex on the command pulpit of his Lehman Russ battle tank, the pride of Mordia, observing the aftermath of a successful but costly assault on a heavily fortified enemy trench line. His company had taken the position, their discipline and superior fire control winning the day, but he had lost a dozen good men in the process. He looked out over the blasted, corpse-strewn landscape, his face a grim, emotionless mask. He felt no joy in the victory, only the cold, hard calculus of the cost. He saw one of his troopers roughly kicking the corpse of a fallen enemy soldier. Rex's voice, sharp and cold, crackled over the squad vox. "Trooper, you will show respect for the dead. They were traitors to the Emperor, but they were men, and they fought with courage. We are the Iron Guard, not savages. Act like it." The trooper immediately stiffened and saluted. Rex turned his gaze back to the horizon, to the next trench line that had to be taken, and the one after that. He was confident, he was resolute, his faith in the power of discipline and honor was absolute. It was a shield he believed that could protect his soul from the brutalizing horrors of this or any war. He was tragically and completely wrong. The meat grinder of Viridian Fork was not just a war of soldier against soldier. It was a war against the cold, indifferent calculus of the Departamento Munitorum and the ego of its distant commanders. Miles behind the front lines, in a clean, secure, and well-lit command bastion, Lord General Draven, a man whose primary battles were fought on the political fields of the Imperial Court, looked down at a clean, hololithic map of the war zone. To him, the conflict was a neat, tidy game of strategy, a series of green and red icons on a glowing board. He did not see the mud or the blood or the faces of the men whose lives were represented by those icons. He saw only a stubborn enemy salient that was holding up his timetable, a messy wrinkle on an otherwise perfect map, and he wanted it erased. The order that came down to Captain Rex was a masterpiece of this detached armchair generalship. He was to take his company and launch a direct, full-frontal daylight assault on a heavily fortified enemy position known as the Iron Redoubt. It was a fortress of concrete and steel, bristling with heavy stubbers and lascannons. Its approach is a perfectly sited killing field of mines and razor wire. To assault it without a month of preparatory artillery bombardment was not just tactically unsound, it was suicidal. Rex, the consummate professional, immediately saw the insanity of the plan. He voxed his immediate superior, a pompous, glory-seeking colonel named Faust, and lodged a formal tactical protest. Colonel Rex's voice was a model of respectful but firm discipline. "I must object to the proposed assault plan. A direct charge will result in catastrophic and unnecessary casualties. I have scouted a flanking route through the undersprawl. It will be slower, but it will allow us to bypass their main guns and has a 78% higher probability of success with a projected 90% reduction in losses. The reply from Colonel Fust was sharp, arrogant, and laced with a veiled threat. "Are you questioning a direct order from the Lord General Captain Rex? Your job is to obey, not to strategize. The Iron Guard's reputation is built on courage and swift, decisive action, not skulking through sewers. Take the redoubt." "That is an order." The channel went dead. Rex stood in his command trench, his fist clenched so tight that his knuckles were white. He was trapped between his duty to obey and his duty to protect the men under his command. The two had, for the first time, become mutually exclusive. His face a mask of cold, hard iron, he summoned the leader of his 3rd platoon, a young, brave lieutenant named Gallo, a man Rex had personally mentored. He gave the order. He did not and could not show the rage and despair he felt. He simply laid out the suicidal plan as if it were a sound and logical course of action. Lieutenant Gallo, a true son of Mordian, did not question it. He simply saluted, gathered his men, and prepared to die. From his command post, Rex watched through his magnoculars as the 3rd platoon went over the top. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The moment they entered no man's land, the Iron Redoubt came to life a storm of pre-sighted mortar fire and overlapping heavy weapons emplacements. The Mordians, for all their discipline, were cut down like wheat in a harvest. Rex listened to the frantic, dying screams on the Vox, listened as Lieutenant Gallo's final choked report of "objective not taken" dissolved into a burst of static. In the space of 10 minutes, his entire 3rd platoon, 35 men he had known and trained, were gone. Rex stood motionless for a long time after the silence fell, the magnoculars still pressed to his eyes, watching the smoke drift over the field where his men now lay dead. The cold, professional sadness he had felt after his previous victories was gone. In its place, something new was born, something hot, sharp, and utterly pure. It was rage, a white-hot, righteous, and all-consuming rage. It was not directed at the enemy who had so efficiently killed his men. It was a rage directed at the incompetence, the arrogance, and the sheer criminal stupidity of the commanders, who had, for the sake of a clean line on a map, just thrown 35 good lives away for nothing. This was the first step on the eightfold path. The frustration had finally curdled into true, undiluted anger. The rage that had been born in Captain Rex after the slaughter of his 3rd platoon was a cold, hard knot in his gut. It was a fuel, and it burned away the weariness, replacing it with a sharp, dangerous focus. But it was also a poison, and it began to corrode the iron walls of his discipline and honor. The test of this new corrupted resolve came a week later. Following another poorly conceived order from High Command, the remainder of Rex's company was sent to clear a ruined administratum sector, a mission that was in fact a carefully laid trap. The Viridian secessionists, anticipating their textbook advance, collapsed the surrounding buildings with pre-placed demolition charges, and Rex and his men found themselves cut off, surrounded, and besieged in the rubble of a hab block. The situation was hopeless. They were outnumbered 3-1, low on ammunition, and the enemy was slowly, methodically closing the net. The Vox was filled with the triumphant, jeering taunts of the secessionist commander. Rex's mind, a finely tuned tactical instrument, raced through the possibilities. A last stand would be a glorious but utterly pointless end, another waste of good soldiers for the sake of a flawed strategy. Surrender was not in the vocabulary of a Mordian officer. There was no honorable way out. But the new cold rage in his soul was not interested in an honorable death. It was interested in victory. It was interested in making the enemy pay. And it began to look for options that the old honorable Captain Rex would have never considered. His augur officer pointed out an anomaly on the tactical display. So the officer reported, his voice tight with desperation. There's a large group of non-combatants, 100 or more, huddled in the sub-level cellar of the building between us and the enemy's weakest flank. The old Rex would have seen this as a terrible complication, a group of innocents to be protected. The new Rex, the Rex whose mind was now poisoned with rage and a contempt for the weakness that had cost him, his men saw something else. He saw a tool. He saw a key. He saw a shield made of soft, expendable flesh. A brief, violent war was fought in the silence of his own mind. The man of honor, the believer in the Tactica Imperialis, and the sanctity of the mission screamed in protest. But the new man, the man forged in the frustration and anger of this meat grinder, screamed louder. Gallo and his men died because of the rules, the new voice snarled in his thoughts. They died because of honor. I will not lose my entire company for the sake of a textbook that was written by generals who never had to smell the rot of a trench. He had to win. He had to prove that his men's lives were not a currency to be wasted. And if the price of that victory was the blood of 100 strangers, then it was a price he was now willing to pay. His voice when he gave the order was a cold, dead thing, a sound his men had never heard before. Sergeant, take a squad. Go to that cellar, get the civilians. The grizzled old sergeant, a man who had served with Rex for a decade, looked at him in disbelief. Sir, for what purpose? We cannot protect them here. Rex's gaze was like chips of ice. We are not protecting them, Sergeant. He said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. We are using them. Herd them out into the street ahead of our position. They will be our cover. We are breaking out through them. The sergeant's face went pale. Captain, that is a war crime. Rex took a step forward, his face inches from the sergeant's. What is a greater crime, Sergeant? He snarled. The death of 100 who were already doomed, or the loss of an entire company of the Emperor's finest soldiers because their commander was a coward. The code got 35 of our brothers killed. I will not let it kill the rest of us. Now you have your orders. The scene that followed was a vision of hell. The terrified civilians, men, women, and children were forced from the cellar at gunpoint, their screams and pleas for mercy ignored. They were herded into the street, a human wave of terror and confusion. Advance Rex roared, and his men, their faces grim masks of shock and a terrible newfound resolve, moved forward behind the shield of screaming flesh. The secessionist soldiers on the other side, seeing the approaching mob of civilians, hesitated their own humanity, momentarily staying their hand. It was the opening Rex needed. Fire, he commanded. The Mordians' lasguns erupted their disciplined volleys, cutting through the civilians and into the enemy ranks behind them. The street became a charnel house, the air filled with the screams of the dying and the snap hiss of last fire. Rex and his men charged through the carnage, their boots slipping on the blood of the very people they had just used as a shield, and crashed into the faltering enemy line. They broke through. They had survived. As they regrouped in the relative safety of a captured sector, leaving a street filled with the dead behind them, Rex looked at the faces of his men. The respect they once had for him was gone, replaced by a new, terrible fear. He looked at his own chainsword dripping with the blood of both soldier and civilian, and crushed the last dying embers of his old honor. The ends justify the means, he told himself, the lie a cold comfort in the ruins of his soul. In the quiet, tense aftermath of the breakout, Captain Rex found himself alone in his new makeshift command post, a shattered administratum office. The adrenaline of the battle had faded, leaving behind the cold, sour taste of what he had done. The faces of the civilians, their eyes wide with terror in the moments before his men had opened fire, were ghosts that flickered at the edge of his vision. He crushed the images with a surge of cold, hard logic. It was a necessity. It was a victory. He had saved his company. He repeated the words to himself, a litany to ward off the encroaching shadows of his own conscience. As a man of iron discipline, he knew that idle hands bred doubt. He turned to the one ritual that had always centered him, the one act of pure, clean order in a universe of chaos, the maintenance of his war gear. He laid his chainsword on a table, its teeth still clogged with the gore and viscera of the battle. It was a standard-issue officer's blade, a tool he had wielded for decades, its weight and balance as familiar to him as his own hand. He began the meticulous process of cleaning it. He removed the outer casing, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he exposed the engine block. He took a wire brush and began to scrape the clotted blood and flesh from between the blade's diamond-hard teeth, the action both a grim necessity and a form of penance. As his bare fingers worked along the length of the blade, he noticed something strange. The metal, which should have been cold from the damp night air, felt warm to the touch. It was not the heat of a recently used engine, but a faint, almost biological warmth, a subtle, pleasant heat that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. He paused, frowning, and placed his full palm against the flat of the blade. The warmth was undeniable. He dismissed it as a strange, residual energy from the dozens of bodies it had passed through, a quirk of the machine's spirit. He finished his work oiling the chain and resecuring the casing. The final step was to test the engine. He held the weapon firmly and activated it. The familiar, savage roar of the chainsword's motor filled the small room, a sound of pure mechanical fury that had always brought him a sense of grim comfort. But this time, woven into the familiar, grinding snarl of the engine, he heard something else. It was not a sound in the air. It was a vibration, a resonance that traveled up his arm and seemed to whisper directly into the bones of his skull. It was a deep, guttural, and impossibly ancient sound, a single monosyllabic thought that was not his own, carried on the roar of the engine. Good. Rex instantly deactivated the weapon. The silence that rushed back into the room was sudden and absolute. He stared at the chainsword, his heart for the first time in years pounding with something other than the thrill of battle. It was fear, an auditory hallucination, he told himself, a symptom of combat stress, of exhaustion, of the terrible choices he had just made. He was a Mordian officer. He was a man of logic and discipline. He did not believe in ghosts in the machine. He forced the experience from his mind, classifying it as a momentary lapse, a flicker of weakness. But as he placed the chainsword back in its scabbard, the feeling lingered. The warmth on his palm, the echo of that impossible approving whisper. And a new, deeply unsettling thought, a thought that felt both alien and strangely natural, began to take root in the back of his mind. The thought that the weapon, his faithful tool of war, had been pleased by the day's bloody work. He had made his first unknowing sacrifice of blood for the sake of victory, and something ancient, terrible, and thirsty had taken notice. The victory that Captain Rex had purchased with the blood of civilians had a chilling effect on his command. His tactics grew bolder, more aggressive, and undeniably more effective. He began to favor strategies that were brutal and direct, eschewing his previous elegant maneuvers for the simple bloody calculus of overwhelming force. His men who had once admired his honor now feared his cold, newfound ruthlessness. But they followed his orders without question, for his new methods, however savage, brought them victories. The anger that had been born from the loss of his 3rd platoon had become a sharpened, lethal tool, and he wielded it with a terrifying and ever-growing proficiency. The path of the Mordian 84th was now a trail of butchery, but it was a trail that led them ever deeper into the heart of the enemy's territory. The moment of his true spiritual fall came during the assault on the secessionists' primary command bastion in Hive Secundus. Rex and his company were at the spearhead of the attack, fighting their way through the fortified corridors. In the heart of the bastion, he was met by the enemy's champion, a veteran captain of the Viridian Royal Guard, a man as renowned for his skill with a power sword as Rex was. The man was his equal, a mirror image of the honorable soldier Rex himself had once been. Their duel was a spectacle of perfect swordsmanship, a blur of crackling blue energy fields, and the clang of adamantium on plasteel. It was a battle of pure, disciplined skill. Rex, with his superior Mordian training, was winning. He saw the opening a flaw in his opponent's guard, a clear path for a clean, honorable, and fatal thrust to the heart. It was the kind of victory he had once prided himself on. But as he prepared to make the killing blow, the warmth in his chains would return, a hot, pulsing thrum that resonated up his arm. The half-heard whisper in the engine's roar was back no longer a single word, but a feeling, a deep, guttural, and intoxicating promise of more. The memory of his men dying uselessly in the mud because of some far-off general's ego flashed in his mind. The faces of the civilians he had sacrificed. The cold, hard knot of rage in his gut tightened. A clean, honorable victory was no longer enough. It was an insult to the price he had already paid. He needed more than victory. He needed vengeance. He needed to make his enemy feel the rage that was consuming him. He consciously rejected the perfect, clean kill. A raw, bestial roar, a sound he had never made before, tore itself from his throat. He abandoned his perfect, disciplined form and gave himself over to the red tide of his own fury. He did not thrust his chainsword. He swung it in a great, savage arc, not at his opponent's heart, but at his sword arm, the roaring teeth of the blade shearing through armor, flesh, and bone. The enemy champion screamed a sound of shock and agony. Rex did not stop. He was no longer a duelist, he was a butcher. He brought the roaring blade down again and again and again, dismembering his opponent, turning the once proud warrior into a heap of mangled, twitching meat. The duel had become a savage, animalistic execution. When it was over, Rex stood panting over the unrecognizable remains of his foe, his own immaculate uniform now drenched in the hot, steaming blood of his enemy. His men stared at him in horrified silence. And in that moment he felt it. It was not the cold, grim satisfaction of a tactical objective achieved. It was a hot, euphoric, and utterly intoxicating rush of pure, primal power. It was a feeling of absolute, transcendent joy, a sensation so intense, so vivid, and so real that it made every other victory in his entire life feel like a pale gray shadow. It was the ecstasy of the kill, the pure, undiluted pleasure of total, brutal domination. This was the fifth step on the eightfold path. He had discovered that the act of killing was not just a means to an end, but was a glorious, thrilling, and exquisitely pleasurable reward in itself. He had tasted the true promise of the blood god, and he found it to be delicious. The ecstasy of the kill was a potent and addictive drug, and it began to fundamentally rewire Captain Rex's tactical mind. The man who had once been a master of the elegant, precise strategies of the Tactica Imperialis was now a creature of a singular, brutal desire. The cold, clear logic of the tactician was being steadily and surely replaced by the hot, simple, and all-consuming hunger of the butcher. His men who had once followed him out of respect for his genius now followed him out of a terrified, disciplined awe for his sheer, terrifying ferocity. The Mordian 84th was no longer an instrument of tactical precision. It was becoming a blunt, bloody hammer, and Captain Rex was the hand that swung it. This transformation was laid bare in the planning for the assault on Hive Primus's primary spaceport. It was a fortress, its approaches guarded by interlocking kill zones, fortified bunkers, and the elite of the secessionist army. The old Captain Rex would have spent weeks on reconnaissance planning a complex, multi-pronged assault, involving feints, flanking maneuvers, and a patient, methodical siege. The new Captain Rex dismissed such ideas with a contemptuous snarl. In the briefing with his remaining officers, he laid out his new, brutally simple plan. "We are not skulking in the shadows." He declared, his voice a low growl that vibrated with a barely contained fury. "We are the Iron Guard. We will meet them head-on. A single glorious, full-frontal armored assault straight down the main causeway." A young, brave lieutenant, one of the few who still clung to the old ways, dared to voice his dissent. "Captain," he said, his voice trembling slightly but firm, "my scouts have identified a weakness in their sub-level power conduits. A small demolition team could disable their main gun emplacements. It would be a slower, more subtle approach, but it would save hundreds of lives." Rex turned his gaze upon the lieutenant, and his eyes for a moment seemed to glow with a faint red light. Subtlety, Rex sneered the word, an insult. Subtlety is the tool of the coward and the assassin. The purpose of this battle is not merely to take the spaceport. It is to break the enemy's will. It is to grind their strongest point into dust beneath our treads and show them the futility of their defiance. I do not want a quiet victory. I want a glorious, bloody battle that will echo in the histories of this world for 1,000 years. I want a worthy slaughter. The officers stared back, their faces pale. The tactical genius they had once revered was gone, replaced by a warlord who spoke only the language of blood and fury. The battle that followed was exactly what Rex had promised, a glorious and utterly horrific bloodbath. The Mordian armored column charged directly into the teeth of the enemy's perfectly prepared defenses. Leman Russ tanks were torn apart by pre-sighted Lascannon fire. Chimeras were shredded by heavy bolter emplacements. But the charge did not stop. Rex was at the forefront in his command chimera, the Fury of Mordia, its voxcasters broadcasting not tactical orders, but a single looped and deafeningly loud war hymn. He was no longer a commander directing his forces from a position of tactical advantage. He was a berserker lost in the red haze of battle, his own chainsword roaring as he cut down any enemy who dared to stand before him. They won. They won through sheer unrelenting and suicidal ferocity, their casualties so high that they simply swamped the enemy's defenses with their own dead and dying. When the final bunker had been taken and the last secessionist soldier lay dead, Rex stood atop a mountain of burning tanks and mangled corpses. His subordinate officer, his face pale and spattered with blood, approached him. "We have the spaceport, Captain." The officer reported, his voice hollow. "But we lost nearly half the company." Rex turned to him, a wild, joyful, and utterly insane light in his eyes. He looked out at the apocalyptic scene of carnage, at the hundreds of his own dead men lying beside the thousands of the enemy, and he did not see a tragedy. He saw a masterpiece. Good Rex said, his voice a triumphant roar that was almost a prayer. It was a good fight, a worthy offering. The officer recoiled in horror. He finally understood. His captain no longer measured victory in objectives taken or ground gained. He measured it in blood. The lives of his own men were no longer a precious resource to be preserved, but a glorious fuel to be spent in the ever more furious fire of his new, terrible god. The capture of the spaceport, bought at the cost of half his company, had left Captain Rex's forces dangerously overextended. They were an island of Mordian iron in a sea of secessionist fury, and the enemy was regrouping for a massive, inevitable counterattack. The tactical situation was dire. They had achieved their objective, but they could not hope to hold it. The logical, militarily sound decision was to perform a fighting withdrawal to consolidate their gains, preserve their remaining strength, and wait for the main regimental force to catch up. This was the exact counsel brought to Rex by his last remaining veteran lieutenant, a brave and loyal officer named Fendril. He approached Rex in the blood-soaked command center, a data slate in his hand, his face a mask of grim but professional concern. Captain Fendril began, his voice steady. "The enemy is massing for a full-scale counter-assault from 3 directions. Our casualty rate stands at 62%. We are low on anti-tank munitions. By every metric of the Tactica, our position is untenable. I respectfully advise that we pull back to the secondary defense line at Sector Gamma. We can preserve the lives of our remaining men and hold a far more defensible position." It was a sound, logical, and courageous piece of advice, the counsel of a good officer dedicated to his men and the success of the mission. It was also the most heretical thing he could have possibly said to the new Captain Rex. Rex turned to look at him, and his eyes were no longer the cold, calculating eyes of a Mordian tactician. They were the burning, contemptuous eyes of a predator. He heard Fendril's words not as a strategic assessment, but as the weak, sniveling whine of a coward. Retreat, preserve. These words were a blasphemy against the glorious, beautiful truth he had discovered in the heart of the slaughter. The hot, ecstatic rush of the kill was the only thing that now mattered, the only true measure of victory. To retreat from the promise of more bloodshed was the ultimate sin. The whisper in the engine of his chainsword, a sound that was now a constant low thrum in the back of his mind, seemed to grow louder, urging him to purge the weakness, to cut out the rot of fear from his ranks. Cowardice Rex snarled the word, a low, dangerous growl. Fendrel recoiled, shocked. "Sir, it is not cowardice, it is sound tactics. We must—" Rex cut him off. "Silence," he roared, his voice a thunderclap of pure, unrestrained fury. He drew his bolt pistol and fired a single shot into the ceiling of the command center, the explosive report causing his other officers to flinch. Summon the company he commanded. All of them. Now. Minutes later, the exhausted, terrified remnants of his company were assembled in the main hangar, their ranks thin and their eyes haunted. Rex dragged the protesting Lieutenant Fendrel before them. This man Rex bellowed, his voice ringing with the fire of a zealot, speaks of retreat. He speaks of preserving our forces. He speaks the language of the weak, the fearful, and the beaten. He shoved Fendrel to his knees. "I will tell you our purpose. Our purpose is not to survive. Our purpose is to kill. We are the Emperor's fury. We are the righteous fire of vengeance. We will stand here and we will meet the enemy's tide with a wall of our own iron and hate. We will die in this place if we must, but we will take 10,000 of them with us. That is our purpose. That is our glory." He aimed his bolt pistol at the back of Fendrel's head. The lieutenant looked up, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. "Captain Valerius, please." The use of his first name only enraged Rex further. "That man is dead," Rex snarled. "There is only the war." He squeezed the trigger. The bolt pistol's roar echoed in the silent hangar. The last vestige of the old, honorable Mordian guard was executed for the crime of being sensible. Rex stood over the headless corpse of his most loyal officer, his smoking pistol in his hand. He looked out at the sea of pale, terrified faces of his men. "There is no retreat." He whispered, his voice a promise and a threat. "There is only blood." The execution of Lieutenant Fendrel had purged the Mordian 84th of its last vestiges of tactical reason. Captain Rex's authority was now absolute, his rule enforced not by respect, but by a cold, unwavering terror. His company was no longer an army of disciplined soldiers. They were a cult of personality, a weapon honed to the single brutal purpose of their commander's ever-growing bloodlust. They did not have to wait long to unleash it. As predicted, the secessionist army, seeing the Mordians overextended and weakened, launched a massive, coordinated counterattack determined to reclaim the spaceport. They were met not by a tired, beleaguered company, but by a force of pure, fanatical fury, led by a captain who had cast aside all pretense of defense. Rex did not wait for the enemy to come to him. He met their charge with his own. He was the first over the barricades, his chainsword a roaring instrument of butchery, his voice a constant bellowing roar of hatred. He fought like a man possessed, a demigod of the battlefield. His men, their minds now numb to the horror, their only instinct to obey the terrifying force of their captain's will, followed him into the meat grinder. The battle for the spaceport's perimeter was one of the most savage in the entire Viridian campaign. It was a chaotic, close-quarters brawl where tactics were forgotten and only the will to kill mattered. In the heart of the fighting, Rex sought out the enemy commander, a decorated secessionist general leading the charge. Their duel was not a contest of skill. It was an act of brutal, animalistic dominance. Rex's chainsword shattered the general's power sword, and he ended the fight not with a clean thrust, but by driving the roaring teeth of his blade through the general's face. As the general fell, Rex did something he had never done before. Driven by a new powerful and deeply alien instinct, he did not move to the next target. He placed his boot on the dead man's chest, and with a single savage pull, he tore the severed head and spine from the body. He held it aloft, a grotesque, dripping trophy, and let out a roar of pure, triumphant fury. The secessionist soldiers, seeing their leader's horrific end, faltered. Their morale broke, and the counterattack dissolved into a panicked rout, which Rex's men purged with merciless efficiency. After the battle back in his command center, the skull of the enemy general was not discarded. Rex, acting on that same new instinct, spent hours meticulously cleaning it. He scraped the flesh from the bone and polished the cranium until it was a stark white symbol of his victory. He then mounted it on a spike on the wall behind his command chair. The narrator's voice on the recording is low and grim. He told himself it was a message, a warning to his enemies, and a symbol of his company's unyielding strength. He could not know, did not want to know, that he was performing a sacred and ancient rite. He was making his first deliberate physical offering to the Lord of Skulls. He was building his first altar. This new grim habit became a ritual. After every significant engagement, Rex would hunt down the enemy's strongest warrior, their greatest champion, and after slaying them, he would claim their skull for his growing collection. His command post, once a place of neat ordered tactical maps and disciplined reports, began to transform into a macabre Khorne shrine. The skulls of his enemies, each one a testament to a worthy kill, stared out with empty eyes from the walls. And another ritual was born. After every bloody victory, standing atop the steaming piles of the dead, Rex would throw back his head and unleash a long, savage and blood-curdling roar. It was a sound that was no longer entirely human, a cry of pure, sated bloodlust, and his men, now bound to his will by fear and a shared, brutalizing violence, would roar with him, their collective cry a sound of pure, animalistic fury that would echo across the blasted landscape. He believed it to be a new battle cry. The narrator's voice explains a way to honor the ferocity of his soldiers. He did not recognize it for what it was, a prayer. A wordless, joyous hymn of slaughter sent across the warp to the ears of the blood god who sat upon his brass throne, listened, and was greatly, greatly pleased. The blood god, his thirst momentarily slaked by the constant offerings of blood and skulls from his new, unwitting disciple, was pleased. And when Khorne is pleased, he rewards his most promising champions not with wealth or knowledge, but with a gift of greater capacity for his sacred work. He rewards them with strength. He rewards them with fury. The first of these blessings descended upon Captain Rex during the brutal battle for the grand spire of Viridian Secundus. Rex and his company were in the heart of the fighting, a chaotic, swirling melee against the elite household guard of the secessionist governor. Rex was a whirlwind of destruction, his chainsword a constant roaring engine of death. He found himself surrounded, a dozen enemy soldiers pressing in on him. For a mortal man, even a Mordian captain, it would have been the end. But as Rex threw back his head and let out a roar of pure, defiant rage, something changed. One of his own troopers, a young private, looked at his captain in that moment and saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Rex's eyes, visible in the flash of a nearby explosion, were no longer the cold, disciplined blue of a Mordian officer. They were glowing with a hot, furious, and utterly inhuman crimson light, like coals in a forge. In that same instant, Rex felt a surge of raw, explosive power flood his limbs, a strength that was not his own. His roar became a shockwave of pure force. He swung his chainsword, and the arc of the blade was no longer just the movement of a man, but the strike of a demigod. The weapon tore through the armor, flesh and bone of 3 men, at once their bodies exploding in a shower of gore. He was no longer just a skilled soldier, he was becoming a living avatar of the battle itself. The blessings did not stop there. In a later engagement, a lucky shot from an enemy sniper struck him in the shoulder, a high-caliber round that should have shattered his collarbone and rendered his arm useless. He felt a flash of white-hot, agonizing pain. And his response to that pain was not shock or a cry for a medic. His response was rage, a pure volcanic and all-consuming fury at the audacity of the enemy to have wounded him. And as this rage surged through him, the pain vanished. He felt the wound not just numb, but actively seal itself, the torn muscles knitting back together, the bleeding stopping, all fueled by the sheer cauterizing power of his own anger. The narrator's voice on the recording is a low, grim whisper. His fury was becoming his shield. His hatred was becoming his restorative balm. The blood god was ensuring that his favored instrument of slaughter would not be so easily broken. The man that Valerius Rex had been was now all but gone. He no longer required sleep, the very concept of fatigue, now a distant alien memory belonging to a weaker species. He felt only two states of being: the quiet, simmering hunger for a battle before it began, and the ecstatic, roaring fulfillment of that hunger in the heart of the slaughter. His men no longer saw him as a captain. They saw him as a supernatural force, a demon of war in the uniform of a Mordian officer. They no longer followed him out of discipline. They followed him out of a primal, terrified awe caught up in the wake of his ever-growing holy fury. Rex himself, in the rare, quiet moments between battles, would feel the unnatural power thrumming in his veins. The old Rex would have recognized these changes as the foul taint of the warp, a corruption to be purged with prayer and a bolt pistol to his own head. But the new Rex, the Rex whose soul had been reforged in rage and blood, welcomed them. He saw these gifts not as a corruption, but as a divine reward, a sign that his pure, uncompromising devotion to the true spirit of war was being recognized and blessed. He was becoming a god of battle, and he found the apotheosis to be glorious. The transformation of Captain Rex from a respected commander into a blood-crazed demigod did not go unnoticed. While many of his troopers were too terrified or too caught up in the new, savage glory of their victories to question him, a small core of the company's command structure, the last remnants of the old honorable Mordian Guard, saw the truth. The company's commissar, a man named Khorne, was a veteran of 100 campaigns, his eyes trained to see the subtle signs of corruption. And what he saw in Captain Rex was no longer subtle. He saw the glowing red eyes in the heat of battle, the unnatural strength, the altar of skulls growing in the command post, and the utter joyful madness that had replaced the cold, tactical genius he had once respected. Khorne knew what he was seeing. This was not battle fatigue. This was the mark of the arch-enemy. He gathered the few he could still trust in a secret, desperate conclave in a fortified cellar, the company's master of ordnance, the grizzled sergeant of the 1st platoon, and a handful of other veteran non-commissioned officers. Their faces were grim, their loyalty to their captain at war with their ultimate loyalty to the Emperor. "The man we knew is gone." Khorne stated, his voice a low, grim whisper. "Valerius Rex is dead. The thing that wears his face and screams his orders is a monster, a vessel for the ruinous powers. You have all seen it. Our casualty rates are unsustainable. Our tactics have devolved into mindless butchery. He is leading this company to damnation." The old sergeant nodded, his face a mask of weary sorrow. He executed Fendrel for speaking the truth. He is a tyrant. The commissar's duty was absolute. A taint within the command structure was the most dangerous of all cancers, and it had to be cut out. We cannot face him in open battle. Khorne continued, his mind already working through the terrible calculus of their situation. The blessings of the warp have made him too strong too fast. We must trap him, lure him into a confined space away from the bulk of the company. A tactical briefing in the sub-level command bunker. We will use heavy flamers to contain him and a stasis net to subdue him. The Emperor willing, we can take him alive for judgment. If not..." He did not need to finish the sentence. Their duty was clear. They would commit treason against their commander to save the soul of their company. The trap was set. A message was sent to Rex requesting his presence in the sub-level bunker to discuss the tactical disposition of the enemy's armored reserves. Rex, in his growing arrogance, agreed. He strode into the bunker alone, his posture radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable power. The moment he entered the main chamber, the great blast door boomed shut behind him. From hidden alcoves, the Loyalists emerged, their weapons raised. Valerius Rex Commissar Thorne's voice echoed in the confined space, his bolt pistol aimed squarely at Rex's head. "In the name of the God Emperor, for the crime of heresy and consorting with the archenemy, you are relieved of command. Surrender and face his judgment." Rex did not look surprised. He did not look afraid. He looked disappointed. He slowly turned his head, his eyes now a permanent smoldering crimson, fixing on the Commissar. "Judgment," he sneered, a low, rumbling sound. "I am the judgment." He saw their actions not as a righteous purge, but as the ultimate act of cowardice, a final pathetic attempt by the weak to chain the strong. The whisper in his soul, the voice of the blood god, roared its approval. He unleashed the full demonic might of his new form. The heavy flamers roared to life, engulfing him in a torrent of burning promethium. He simply walked through it, his greatcoat burning away to reveal flesh that was now as tough as iron, the flames doing nothing but making his red eyes burn brighter. The stasis net, a device that could stop a charging orc, was thrown over him. He simply flexed his unnaturally swollen muscles and tore it apart as if it were a spider's web. The fight was a massacre. He moved with a speed and a fury that was utterly terrifying. The Loyalist soldiers, brave veterans of 100 battles, were as children before him. He tore the heavy flamer from one man's hands and used it as a club to crush his skull. He caught the old sergeant's chainsword in his bare hand, the roaring teeth of the blade skittering harmlessly off his supernaturally tough skin before snapping the sergeant's neck. The last one standing was Commissar Thorne. The Commissar stood his ground, his face a mask of iron resolve, his bolt pistol barking as he fired shell after shell into Rex's chest. The bolts exploded, tearing chunks of flesh from the captain, but the wounds sealed almost as fast as they were made, his rage a fire that consumed all pain. Rex closed the distance, his hand lashing out to seize the Commissar by the throat, lifting him from the ground. "You speak of judgment." Rex snarled, his face inches from the Commissar's. "This is judgment." With a single savage twist, he snapped the Commissar's neck and threw the body aside like a broken doll. He stood alone in the silent, bloody bunker, surrounded by the corpses of the last good men in his company, his own hands having just purged the final vestiges of honor and discipline from the Mordian 84th. Rex emerged from the silent, bloody bunker. His armor scorched his body, covered in the blood of his own loyal officers. He was no longer just a captain. He was a butcher, a tyrant, a kinslayer. The remaining troopers of the Mordian 84th, who had been drawn by the sounds of the conflict, stood waiting in the hangar, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. They saw their captain, their icon of discipline, emerge from the tomb of their command structure, and they saw the carnage within. Rex did not try to hide what he had done. He did not offer excuses or lies. He climbed atop the wrecked chassis of a chimera, the bodies of the slain Loyalists, a gruesome backdrop, and he preached a new and terrible gospel. "Your officers are dead." His voice, now a permanent gravelly roar, boomed through the hangar. "Your Commissar is dead." They were weak. They spoke of tactics and preservation. They tried to put a leash on the spirit of the warrior. They sought to deny us our true and only purpose. He brandished his blood-soaked chainsword. "For months we have bled in this meat grinder. We have died for the plans of fat, distant generals who do not know our names. We have sacrificed our brothers for inches of mud. And for what? For an honor that left our comrades dead in a field? For a discipline that had us bow to the commands of fools." He pointed his roaring blade at the terrified soldiers. "I offer you a new path, a path of strength, a path of purity, the purity of the charge, the glory of the kill, the honest, simple truth of blood on steel. The corpse god on his golden throne is a distant, silent master. But there is another god, a true god, a god who watches every battle, who revels in the strength of the warrior, and who rewards those who serve him with true, tangible power. He has blessed me with his strength, and he will bless all of you who have the courage to cast off the shackles of cowardice and embrace the purity of war. His crimson eyes swept across the crowd, and his men who had witnessed his supernatural fury, who were already brutalized and half-mad from the endless war, began to feel a new dark fire kindle in their souls. The fear they felt for him was beginning to curdle into a form of terrible divine awe. To seal this new unholy pact, Rex commanded a final terrible sacrament. "The men who lay in that bunker betrayed us," he snarled. "They betrayed the true spirit of the warrior. Their blood is the price of their weakness. Now it will be the symbol of our new strength." He issued his first command as a Chaos Lord. "Their blood is the paint with which we will baptize ourselves anew. Erase the colors of the weak. We will wear only the color of the kill." What followed was a grim, silent, and horrifying ritual. The troopers, their faces blank masks of shock and a dawning terrible zeal, obeyed. They collected the blood of their fallen commissar and their dead officers. With their own hands they smeared the hot crimson blood over their immaculate blue and white Mordian uniforms. They painted over the Imperial Aquila, replacing it with a simple, brutal, bloody handprint. They were washing away their old loyalties, their old identities in the blood of their own brothers. When the ritual was complete, the company was transformed. They were no longer the pristine, disciplined Iron Guard. They were a terrifying sight, their armor a mismatched, dripping crimson, their eyes now holding a wild, fanatical light. Rex looked down upon his new creation, his new cult of war, and his roar of approval was a sound of pure, triumphant fury. "The Mordian 84th is dead," he bellowed. "It died of weakness and the disease of honor. We are reborn in the blood of the worthy. We are the Crimson Guard. Our loyalty is not to a corpse on a throne, but to the throne of skulls itself. Our war is not for this planet. Our war is eternal." The narrator's voice on the recording is a low, grim whisper. The fall was now complete. The company had not just been defeated. It had been consumed and reborn. It was no longer a cog in the Imperial war machine. It was a new rogue and utterly damned entity, a chaos warband, and its thirst for blood was only just beginning. The birth of the Crimson Guard sent a shockwave of blasphemy and terror through the Imperial command structure on Viridian 4th. An entire company of the famed Mordian Iron Guard vanished only to be replaced by a new savage warband that fought with the discipline of Mordian, but the fury of a demonic host. In response, the Lord General of the sector, in his desperation, dispatched his most feared and respected asset, Lord Commissar Valdemar, a man whose reputation for unbending will was known across the segmentum. By a cruel twist of fate, Valdemar was the very same commissar who decades ago at the Schola Progenium had seen the spark of greatness in a young idealistic cadet named Valerius Rex, and had personally mentored him. He was sent to investigate the fate of his former student, and, if necessary, to be his final judge. Valdemar did not arrive with an army. To do so would have been to invite a battle, and his purpose was not to fight a warband, but to confront a man. He arrived at the Crimson Guard's bloody, skull-adorned encampment alone, a single stark figure in his black greatcoat and peaked cap, his presence an aura of absolute, fearless authority that even the blood-crazed renegades seemed to respect. He demanded an audience with their leader, and Rex, his curiosity piqued by the arrival of this ghost from his past, granted it. They met in the center of the camp, surrounded by the silent, watching eyes of Rex's new, blood-painted warriors. Valdemar's old, weathered face was a mask of grim sorrow. Valerius Rex, the Lord Commissar, began his voice, the same steady, authoritative tone that had once guided the young Rex through the Tactica Imperialis. "Look at what you have become. A butcher, a heretic leading an army of butchers. I came here hoping to find a man I once respected, a soldier of honor. Is that man still in there somewhere beneath all this blood and rage? Rex looked at his former mentor, and his crimson eyes held no flicker of recognition, no sentimentality, only a profound and burning contempt. That man died in the mud of this Emperor-forsaken world. Rex snarled, his voice a low, bestial growl. He died listening to the orders of incompetent fools like the ones you serve. He was killed by the very honor and discipline you hold so dear. I have been reborn in the purity of the fight, old man. I have found a purpose that is real, a god who rewards strength, not a silent corpse on a gilded throne. Valdemar's expression hardened. The student he had known was truly gone. Then the man I once respected must be laid to rest, he said, his voice cold as the void. And the monster that wears his face must be put down. With a smooth, practiced motion, he drew his power sword, its blue energy field humming to life. In the name of the Emperor, I sentence you to death for the crime of heresy. Rex let out a short, brutal laugh. Your Emperor has no power here. He roared and drew his own roaring, gore-splattered chainsword. The duel began. It was a perfect, terrible battle, a clash of two opposing philosophies. Lord Commissar Valdemar fought with the flawless, precise, and disciplined swordsmanship of the Mordian officer schools. Every move was a textbook parry, a perfect riposte, a calculated thrust. He was the embodiment of the cold, hard logic of imperial warfare, the very ideal he had once taught to Rex. Rex, in contrast, fought with a savage, unrestrained, and overwhelming fury. His attacks were not the calculated moves of a fencer, but the brutal, bone-shattering blows of a berserker. He did not parry. He hammered his opponent's blade aside with sheer demonic force. He did not seek an opening. He created one by smashing through his opponent's guard. For all his age, Valdemar was a master, and he put up a masterful defense, his skill and experience holding the line against Rex's monstrous strength. He even scored a hit his power sword, leaving a deep, burning gash across Rex's chest. Rex simply laughed as the wound sealed itself with an unholy fire. In that moment, Valdemar knew he was not fighting a man, but a demigod. With a final desperate surge, Rex brought his chainsword down in a great two-handed arc. The blow shattered Valdemar's power sword, the blade exploding in a shower of blue sparks, and sent the old commissar staggering to his knees, disarmed and defeated. He looked up at the monstrous figure of his former student, his face not one of fear, but of a deep, profound pity. "So this is the freedom you have chosen, Valerius," he rasped. "The freedom of a rabid dog on a bloody chain that you cannot even see." The use of his first name, the name of the honorable man he had once been, caused a flicker of something in Rex's mind, a ghost of a memory, but he crushed it with a surge of pure, exhilarating rage. "My name," he roared, raising his chainsword for the final blow, "is Rex the Bloodsworn, and the only chain I wear is the chain of victory." The roaring teeth of the blade descended, and the last ghost of his past, the final symbol of his lost honor, was silenced forever. Rex the Bloodsworn stood panting in the sudden ringing silence, the roaring of his chainsword the only sound. At his feet lay the broken body of Lord Commissar Valdemar, the man who had taught him the meaning of honor, his blood, now a dark, spreading stain on the dusty ground. The warriors of the Crimson Guard, who had watched the duel with a mixture of terror and religious awe, let out a single unified and bestial roar of approval. Their champion was victorious. Their god was the stronger god. But Rex was not in a state of berserker rage. In the wake of this ultimate act of patricide, this final brutal severing of his past, he felt a strange and terrible clarity, a sense of cold, divine purpose that he had never known before. He knew what he had to do next. With a slow, deliberate, and almost reverent motion, he knelt beside the body of his slain mentor. This was not the savage, instinctual act of a butcher claiming a trophy. This was the solemn ritualistic act of a priest preparing a sacrifice. He took a combat knife from his belt, and with a surgeon's precision he severed the Lord Commissar's head from his body. He held the skull in his hands, the face of the man who had embodied all the discipline and honor he had cast aside, its expression now a frozen mask of sorrowful disappointment. As he held this final relic of his former life, the whispers that had haunted him, the voice that had lived in the engine of his sword, finally spoke to him with a perfect, terrible clarity. It was not a sound but a pure concept, a rune of rage and honor burned directly into his soul. It was a name of power, the name of the god he now served, Khorne. In that moment of revelation, everything clicked into place. The rage that had festered in his heart, the ecstatic joy he had found in the act of the kill, the obsessive growing collection of skulls, the unnatural strength that now flowed through his veins, it all had a source. It all had a name. He was not a man going mad. He was a man being chosen. He was a vessel being filled with a divine and holy purpose. He stood the skull of his mentor in one hand, his roaring chainsword in the other, and climbed to the highest point of the blood-soaked encampment, a mountain of rubble and corpses. He held the skull high, a dark offering against the grey, uncaring sky of Viridian 4 for all his men to see. For too long we have bled for a silent emperor. He roared, his voice no longer just a commander's bark, but a prophet's sermon. For too long we have died for the foolish plans of weak, distant generals. We have fought for an honor that brought us only death and a discipline that chained us to failure. No more he shook the skull at the heavens. Today we fight for a God who answers, a God who does not hide behind walls of gold, but sits upon a throne of skulls, a God of strength, a God of battle, a God who thirsts as we thirst. His crimson eyes blazed with a fire that was not his own. He bellowed the name that had been gifted to him, a name that was both a prayer and a challenge, a sound that tore from his throat and seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. Khorne, take your tithe. Take this skull, the skull of a man of honor and law, the last vestige of my weakness. I offer it to you. And in return, I ask only for one thing, your eternal, glorious war. The response was immediate and spectacular. The sky above Viridian 4th, which had been a dull, overcast grey for the entire miserable campaign, began to bleed. A deep, blood-red light began to seep through the clouds, as if a vast and wounded god was bleeding behind the veil of the heavens. The clouds themselves began to churn and swirl, not with the motion of the wind, but with a palpable, furious energy. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a raw, weeping wound, a tear in the fabric of reality that shone down upon the battlefield with a malevolent crimson light. The war for Viridian 4 was no longer a simple conflict between secessionists and the Imperium. It had become a holy war, a consecrated ground, a beachhead for the ruinous powers in a sector that had known only the Emperor's light. The narrator's voice on the recording is a low, grim whisper. He had completed the 7th step of the path. He had made his final conscious sacrifice. The blood god had heard his prayer, had accepted his offering, and was now ready to bestow upon his new favored champion the final, terrible gift of damnation. As Rex's roar of devotion echoed across the blood-soaked land, the bleeding sky above Viridian 4 answered. A single impossibly vast vortex of crimson energy formed directly above him, a whirlpool in the sea of the warp. From its center, a pillar of pure, solidified rage, a column of blood-red lightning descended with the speed of a striking meteor. It did not strike the ground. It struck Rex. He was engulfed in a cocoon of raw, chaotic power, his form silhouetted against a light so intense, so furious, that his own men, the newly christened Crimson Guard, were forced to shield their eyes. They could not see him, but they could hear him. They heard not a scream of pain, but a roar of pure, unadulterated and triumphant ecstasy. And they heard the sounds of his transformation, the sharp cracking reports of bones being broken and forcibly regrown into new, more powerful configurations, and the high-pitched screech of his Imperial Guard armor being twisted, melted, and reforged by the unholy divine power of the warp. Inside the storm of light, Rex was not in agony. He was in a state of absolute apotheosis. He felt the raw, limitless power of the blood god pouring into him, a fire that did not burn but purified. It burned away the last lingering ghosts of his former self, the memory of his oath to the Emperor, the faint echo of his mentor's disappointed face, the very concept of mercy and restraint. His already supernaturally enhanced strength was magnified 1,000-fold. His senses exploded outwards. He could now literally see the fear of his own men as a shimmering pale aura, and he could taste the promise of future bloodshed on the very air. He felt his flesh and his armor melting together, the distinction between man and warplate becoming meaningless. He was not a man in a suit of armor anymore. He was becoming armor itself. He was becoming war itself. When the crimson light finally receded, the being that stood in the center of the crater was no longer a man. It was a demigod of slaughter. He stood a full head taller, his body now a hulking, monstrous sculpture of swollen, demonic muscle and dark iron. His immaculate Mordian uniform was gone, consumed, and reforged into a suit of baroque, terrifying chaos armor. The once proud blue and white had been replaced by plates of pitted black iron and trims of gore-stained brass. The imperial aquila on his chest had been violently torn and twisted into the 8-pointed star of chaos, a symbol that now pulsed with a faint, malevolent red light. Great iron horns had erupted from his pauldrons, and the knuckles of his gauntlets were now sharpened into brutal iron spikes. His face, once a mask of cold, handsome discipline, was now a snarling, bestial visage of pure, unending hatred, his eyes no longer just glowing, but burning as 2 pits of crimson fire. He took a step, and the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his new iron-shod hooves. He looked at his own transformed hands, and then at the terrified, awe-struck faces of his followers. He raised his chainsword, which had also been transformed, its blade, now a heavier, more brutal thing that wept blood and seemed to roar with a life of its own. The narrator's voice is a low, grim finality. The eightfold path was complete. He had passed through frustration, anger, hatred, violence, joy, sacrifice, and blessing. And now he had received the final terrible reward, damnation. The man who had been Captain Valerius Rex of the Mordian Iron Guard was completely and utterly dead. His soul consumed his body, a vessel for a divine, unholy power. The being that stood in his place had a new name, a name that would be screamed in terror on 1,000 worlds. He was Rex, the blood-sworn, the chosen champion of Khorne, and his only purpose, his only thought, his only joy was to claim the entire bleeding galaxy for his new, thirsty master. Rex the blood-sworn, the being who was once a captain of the Mordian Iron Guard, stood upon the highest peak of his skull altar and surveyed the burning landscape of Viridian Fourth. The petty grinding war between the Imperium and the secessionists, a conflict that had consumed his life and forged his damnation, now seemed small, distant, and utterly insignificant. The blood being spilled here was a mere trickle, a pathetic offering. His new god, the great Lord of Skulls, thirsted for oceans, and his new eternal purpose would not be found in this provincial backwater. He turned to his warband, the blood-painted Crimson Guard, who looked upon him with the adoring, fanatical eyes of true believers. This fight is over, his voice. Now a permanent bestial roar echoed across the encampment. It is too small for us now. Our war is with the galaxy itself. Their new orders were simple. They were to seize the spaceport they had once bled to capture, commandeer the largest vessels, and leave this world behind. Their war for Viridian Force was over, not because it was won, but because it had become boring. As their newly captured blood-consecrated ships ascended into the bleeding red sky, leaving the pointless grinding conflict to burn itself out below, the narrator's voice returns a cold, academic, and final summary. And so ends the chronicle of the fall of Captain Valerius Rex. But the true ultimate horror of his story is not that he became a monster. It is that, in a very real and terrible way, he was finally and truly set free. He was freed from the crushing, impossible burden of honor in a galaxy that has none. He was freed from the weakness of mercy in a universe that rewards only strength. He was freed from the complex, frustrating calculus of tactics, his mind now wonderfully unburdened by anything other than the simple direct line to his enemy's throat. He was freed from the incompetence of his superiors, from the pointless orders of distant generals who spent his men's lives like currency. He was freed from the fear of a meaningless death, for now every kill, every battle, every drop of blood spilled has a single glorious and divine purpose to feed the thirst of his new God. He has been liberated from all the complex, contradictory, and painful things that it is to be a man. But this is the great cosmic lie of chaos. It does not offer true freedom. It offers only a change of masters, a different kind of chain. Rex has cast off the 1,000 complex, fraying chains of his own humanity, his duty, his honor, his compassion, his loyalty to his men. But he has not become a masterless being. He has merely exchanged them all for a single, simple, and utterly unbreakable new chain, a leash forged from pure incandescent rage, its other end held firmly in the brass-gauntleted fist of the Lord of Skulls himself. He has found a state of absolute, perfect freedom in the prison of total, absolute slavery. The final analysis is the most chilling of all. He is no longer a man, a being of complex thoughts and warring emotions, struggling with a painful and often pointless existence. He has been simplified. He has been purified. He is now a function. He is a purpose. He is the divine, blood-soaked will of his God, made manifest in rage and iron. And for a champion of Khorne, for a soul that has been reforged in the purest fires of battle and has tasted the ecstasy of the kill, this is not a state of damnation. It is not hell. The final scene is of Rex the Blood-Sworn, standing on the bridge of his new flagship, the Worthy Slaughter, a vessel that once bore the name Pride of Mordia. He stares into the hololithic star map, no longer looking for tactical advantages, but simply for the brightest concentrations of life, the greatest potential for bloodshed. His crimson eyes burn with a joyous, holy light. He has found his new war, and he knows with a certainty that is a form of bliss that this war will never, ever end. For such a soul, the narrator concludes, this is paradise.